Hello, welcome to Singapore Geospatial Week Plus 2020, an event organized by GeoWorks, Singapore Land Authority's Geospatial Industry Centre. So today we are excited to introduce Adib from Shophouse Co to share more about placemaking with data. So if you have any questions during the webinar, please leave them in the Q&A box and we will answer at the end of the webinar. So thank you, and without further ado, I will pass the presentation over to Adib. Thank you.
Hi everyone. Thank you for spending your Friday afternoon with me. I'm just going to share my screen and then we will just dive straight into it. Okay, so I hope everyone can see my screen. If you have any issues, just type inside the chat and yeah, hopefully somebody will be able to help you along. So my name is Adib. I'm the co-founder and director of a placemaking studio, Shophouse Co. And yes, as introduced just now, we're going to chat about placemaking with data. So to set up the context of what I'll be sharing about in the next 20-25 minutes, so these are the big questions. I'm just going to try and unpack a little bit. So there are two big words here, right? One is placemaking and another one is data. So today I'm just going to share a little bit about what placemaking is about. And some questions there, right? So what kind of place are we trying to make? How do we do the making? And then on the data side, we have all these questions about why data, how do we deal with this, right? What is useful, how to collect, analyze it. So that's kind of like the context of what I hope to share with you. And hopefully we can have a chat about, the details of this. So before we even go into the thing, I just want to start off with introducing this word placemaking. It's a word that has been emerging strongly over the last, I would say, 5 years. Before that, it's been around, but maybe not so much in the public eye. But as a discipline, it's been around for about 4 decades, 40, 50 years. So it's not terribly old and neither is it terribly new. But what is it? First of all, it's a transdisciplinary methodology to create livable urban spaces. So what it means is that placemaking draws on a lot of fields. It draws on architecture, it draws on events, it draws on social sciences, it draws on behavioral insights, it draws on data, right? So it draws on all sorts of methods in order to come together and create livable urban spaces. So that's one thing that you need to know about what placemaking is all about. The second thing is that it's a very collaborative process. So it's not so much a specialist, right? It's not like this great engineer or this great architect who decides what's going to happen to the place. It's a process where all the stakeholders are involved. And when I say stakeholders, I mean everyone, from the land developers to the small business owners, to the people who use it every day, to the people who run the space every day, right? To the operational guys, to the neighbors of that space. So it's a very collaborative process where everybody gets involved to shape this place that they want to create. So that's another second thing that is important in the context of placemaking. And the third that you need to know is that it's a holistic approach. So it's not just about the hardware. It's not just about the built environment. It's also about the programs, right? What happens inside these buildings? What happens inside these spaces on this piece of land? And how is it being run, right? What are the organizational systems behind it? So it's a holistic approach to urban development. And you realize these three phrases are actually very interconnected. And that is what placemaking is all about. And I'm going to share a bit more about what it is in the next few slides. But I hope this kind of gives you a starting point of what you're going to hear over the next 20-25 minutes. So having said all of that, I'm just going to take a second and introduce what I do. So we are the pioneer placemaking studio in Singapore. We started in 2013, so we've been doing this for about 7 years. We work with government agencies, we work with private development companies, communities, and what we really try to help everyone is to create these livable places that we can live, work, and play. And in tangible terms, what that means is that we do strategies. We do a lot of engagements, and it results in a visioning statement or a master plan. And sometimes we take over or deal with existing spaces and we say, what can this space be, right? And this is where we activate the space. We bring communal experiences and co-create all these new users for this space with the community. We also do tactical interventions. So this is what we call prototyping. In the software world, it's a very well-known idea, right? You prototype some of your programs or your apps. But in the built environment, it tends to not be the case. But we have been trying to push for this a lot, and we've been doing this, and also our peers across the world are doing this quite a bit, to say that how can we use this methodology to really test new ideas in the urban environment, right? Can we do something that is light, quick, and cheap so that we can test new ideas and figure out whether it's useful or not? And last but not least, we do training, right? Or sharing sessions like these. So just a glimpse of some of the projects. I will share more a bit later. So we have done projects such as the Summerset Belt Master Plan, which we unveiled earlier this year. So that is a youth precinct in the heart of Orchard Road, which we did earlier this year, we unveiled this year, and we engaged a lot of stakeholders from the businesses in the Orchard Road belt, from the government agencies involved in there, youths directly, and also people from various sectors to really understand what could this space be for them. We also do projects like Podscape, which is a podcast and a physical mobile pod that turns up at various spaces around the city. And we do this to collect sounds and stories of the city. We did this in Bukit Panjang earlier this year as well, so you can check that out on our Instagram. And most recently, we have been working on this thing called Knock Knock, which is a community playbook for neighbors to build relationships with one another. So this is our way of asking the question, how can we build a resilient community by starting at the small scale, which is the neighborly scale? So that's the kind of project that we do. It varies from the very big scale like the master plan to the very small scale like your neighborhoods, or in this case, your neighbors. And over the years, we've been known to be the guys who spark communities. We work a lot with community to create things for spaces. We reimagine and create surprises at the spaces. And I think that is something we've been doing for 7 years and we hope to continue doing for a while. So back to this, right? So the sharing for today, placemaking and data. So first of all, I want to start with the word placemaking. The word already contains two keywords, right? Place and making. And it's fair for us to ask ourselves that question. What kind of place do we want to make? And it links back to the data side of the equation, right? If you want to use data, you need to know what you're collecting data for. And if you go all the way back, it goes back to the idea of place, right? It's like your foundation. What is the place that you want to create? So what kind of place do you want to create? So there are a lot of frameworks out there. These are some examples that I'm going to show from other agencies across the world. So this is by another agency out there where they say that good places need to have protection, comfort, enjoyment, and they have this matrix of 12 different qualities, right? And then NUS also have their own framework, right? There's as you can see on the right-hand side, you have all these little indicators, right? From diversity to social activities, security, management, and you have a whole list of data points for you to collect. And it points back to a particular way of thinking about place, which is their own framework. This is from Project for Public Spaces, our peers in the United States. So they have their own framework and they say, hey, we think that it all revolves around these 4 qualities: sociability, users, comfort, image, and access and linkages. And then from there, we can branch out. So what I'm trying to show you here is that every place or every placemaking project needs to start with this framework, right? And before you can even start thinking about the data component, what is the place that you want to create? And for us at Shophouse Co, we spent a couple of years looking at this question, and we looked at various frameworks across the world, and we came up with our own 8 qualities of a good place, because we realized that most of the frameworks at the end of the day point back towards these 8 qualities. So we have things like how welcoming, comfortable it is, whether it strengthens community bonds, whether it respects narratives and memories, whether it adds value for everyone. So I've added a link there if you want to read a bit more about what this is. But this is the foundation of all the work that we do in Shophouse Co. And right here, when you look at this, you might be wondering, all of these are very abstract, philosophical, emotional stuff, right? It deals with the emotional connection between a physical space and the person, right? When that connection happens, then you have these qualities, which then leads to that question. How then do we collect data for such things? And I think that is the biggest problem for placemaking, right? How do you deal with this? And for us at Shophouse Co, when we think of that question, it comes back to a phrase like this, that maybe not everything that counts can be counted, right? And just because you can count it, it also doesn't mean that it's important. So this is the biggest problem in placemaking with data. And this is a problem that I think a lot of people who are creating urban environments sometimes forget, that just because you can measure it doesn't mean it's important. And I'll give you some example about this. So let's talk about happiness, right? We all say we want to create a happy city. We want to have a lot of happiness in our lives. But how do you measure that? What does happiness look like? How can we measure that, right? It's such an abstract concept. And similarly, right, if you ask yourself, can I measure wealth or can I measure net worth? So for some of us, we say, oh, health is wealth. We have our families, we have our spouses, our partners, our kids, and that is wealthy to us. And for some people, their level of wealth is different. And that's very important. But then what is measurable is often the net worth, right? How much dollars you have, right? What's the value of your assets that you have? So this is the challenge that we have in placemaking as well, about balancing what is that bigger ideal or outcome of a place that we want and what is actually measurable. And so a lot of times in our work, we ask ourselves, what would a human-centered urban data look like? And there's not just one way to do it, but I think if any one of you in the audience right now who's watching this and say, oh, I want to use data for placemaking, I think this is a big question that we need to ask ourselves. What will a human-centered urban data look like? So if you look at ideas of a good place, right? This idea of vibrancy, I think we hear that a lot, that everybody wants to have a vibrant place, that everybody can hang out, you can have fun with your family and friends, right? There's a lot of things to look and see and do, but how can we measure such an abstract idea? So oftentimes we have the quantitative aspect, right? We have the number of activities, we have footfall, and we say, oh, there were 10,000 people in this space. This event attracted 50,000 people, right? Oh, there were 100,000 social mentions on Instagram. So those are quantitative stuff. But if we look deeper into that, you got to ask yourself, are these good measures of vibrancy, right? If you want to create good places, then we got to challenge this thing. For example, what are these 10,000 people who are there doing, right? Were they bored? Who did they come with? Did they do anything? Did they have an enjoyable time? Were they there by choice, or were they passing through, right? Or were they bussed down by somebody just to make up for the numbers? So there's a lot of questions that quantitative data cannot tell us. And that's why for us at Shophouse Co, we kind of layer all our data collection with the qualitative aspects. And this is what I mean by the transdisciplinary approach to placemaking, right? So we look at the keywords and we say, okay, it's good to have social mentions, but what exactly are they saying, right? Does it match up with our intention? What are the stories and memories that people remember or take away? How do they behave there? Were they bored? Were they sitting down? Were they chatting? Or were they just moving around, right? And every place has a very different quality that you want. There are places, for example, in the parks or the beach, where you don't want it to be too vibrant, right? It's just noisy. It breaks the mood of being at a beach, right? You want it to be fun, but not too loud. So every single idea of vibrancy needs to be contextualized to every single space or place. And I think that is another big idea of placemaking, that you cannot have a blanket measure for every single place across Singapore or across the world. It doesn't work that way, because place is a very specific hyperlocal concept that we need to be very sensitive about. So that's kind of give us a glimpse of how we think about data, and what kind of place, the 8 qualities of a good place that we think about. And when we put this together, right, so you see at the bottom, the qualities of a good place are what we call the framework. That's the base foundation for every single thing that we do. And what we have done is that we have created a set of toolkits called the Shophouse Co Place Kit for us to measure and identify and understand every single aspect of the place that we are working on. And the how we use it is not exactly rocket science. And I think a lot of you data people out there watching this would be familiar with this, right? You use it for diagnostic, you use it to decide what action to take, and then you measure whether this has been successful or not. So we do things like field work. So we do a lot of field work. So this is where we draw on ethnographic methods. and social sciences to just spend time on site and listen to and watch people. We do a lot of stakeholder engagement to listen directly to people. So primary data sets is very important to us. And we do a lot of contextual analysis, like, the existing plans, the existing drawings that are out there, and we just look at how they all come together. And then this decides or help us decide what action to take, and then we kind of measure them again at the end as part of a feedback loop to be accountable to our partners and our clients. So a glimpse of what our place kit looks like. So this is just a glimpse of it. So we kind of break up our entire toolkit to various categories. So we do have some that are very spatial in nature, where we do a lot of fieldwork like site observations, we do mapping, we do ethnography, we do a lot of participatory engagements. So we speak to people a lot. And this is where the qualitative and the quantitative layer comes in, right? So it always becomes a mix of voting and direct responses about what they feel or their aspirations that they want to see for that particular space. And then occasionally we involve them in the creation and we say, hey, this is the data that we know. How would you use the data that we have? What would you create out of this information and knowledge that we have? So the place kit that we have developed takes that foundation and expands it depending on the needs of that particular space or place. So a glimpse of what it looks like in photographs. So on the left-hand side, on the top, you see a lot of like red lines where we do mapping. In the middle column, you see people holding up their phones. So that's where we engage the users of the place to document the environment themselves. And this is where you get direct data, right? So you don't just get generic photographs from Google, right? It's not just some anonymous data set. These are data sets that came directly from the people who use the space and who have an emotional connection to that space. So we ask the people who use it and say, what do you tell us directly? What works? What doesn't work? What do you love? What do you not love? And then let's work with it. So that's our approach to how we use data. And at the bottom, you'll see a lot of workshopping, a lot of prototyping, and I will share a bit more information about how we do that in particular projects in a few slides after this. This is one project I just want to quickly share. This project is called Imagining Geylang Serai. So for those of you who are not familiar with Geylang Serai, this is a district in the east side of Singapore, predominantly Malay-centric. We have the famous Geylang Market, we have the Juchat Complex, we have the new Wisma Geylang Serai. And we employ a range of methodologies to collect data about what people want to see in Geylang Serai. So on the right-hand side, you see that survey, right, with the bit.ly link over there. So that was a BuzzFeed-like questionnaire that we sent out to residents and to business owners and to general public in Singapore. And through that BuzzFeed-like question, we were able to collect a large data set about people's emotions and ideas for the precinct. At the same time, we went to the market themselves, the photo on the right or the left, where we spoke directly to the people who went there. And we say, hey, these are options. These are things that we found out. What do you think, right? So we get primary data sets. And then all these other side group discussions that you see, right? These are very targeted conversations that we have. So the data that we collect is very nuanced. There are some that we recognize is meant to have a mass amount of data that we can analyze. Some of it are very specific because we know that this comes from a very particular segment, such as the business owners of the precinct. And then we piece it together, and that's where the placemaker kind of stitches that narrative together and say, all right, from all of these various data sets, from qualitative to quantitative, through specific to mass data, this is what we have learned about the place, and this is how we are going to chart a way forward to make that place. So that's an example of how we use data for Geylang Serai. For Summerset Belt, we did something similar, but we also added some other tools that for this project. We actually walked the site with the youths themselves. And through walking, we were able to identify things like, where is it convenient to cross the road? What do you see when you stand right there at the road, and what's the vista point, right? So these are very site-specific knowledge that you cannot tell from a three-dimensional digital plan. Things that you will interpret differently if it wasn't through the lens of the youth themselves, right? So this is where, again, that lens about how you understand data is important to us. because the people must be at the center of the data collection process, not the data itself. And for this one, we also did a brainstorming and hackathon with the youths. And eventually we created a master plan and some visualizations. And then we brought the visualizations back to the public for them to vote. So we use the visuals a lot so that people can respond to it. And again, once again, you see how we use various data points, various methodologies to establish an idea about what this place should be. My last example for today is this project that we call Junctions at 803. So this is a different kind of experiment or data collection point. So this is where we used actual prototypes and experiments to get data back. So for example, if you see at the bottom that says exercise zone. So that was our attempt at crafting spaces and breaking up the space of the void deck. And this was how we were attempting to say, how do we create a low-cost exercise zone without spending $100,000 in upgrading works, right? So by using stickers and by using like charts that were just printed on foam boards, we were then able to experiment very cheaply. And through this experiment, we were then able to listen directly from the users themselves about what worked, what didn't work, you know? Was this something that they would find useful? Or was there a specific thing that we are missing right now? So this experimentation process allowed us to gather more data, and then we can tell our clients to invest their money in the right place because we have real prototype data that we can bring back. So again, this is not something that you see a lot in urban spaces. You know, a lot of times, like I mentioned just now, you see it in app development and software development. But when you look at building development, where we are looking at millions of dollars in investment, we just think it makes more sense for you to make small experiments, understand it, before you make that leap to make a big investment into upgrading works. Yeah. So a lot of things, even as simple as the kind of chairs to provide for the elderly. So you see right at the bottom right corner over there. So one of our volunteers was speaking to this elderly lady to ask her, you know, is this, you know, what do you do down here? You know, if I were to give you a chair, what would you do here? You know, would you invite your friends? Is this the right kind of chair for you to use? How long will you sit there, right? So this kind of interaction between the prototype and human interaction is a kind of data collection that that is lo-fi, maybe, but it's very rich because it has so much contextual information that for us to decide how do we move forward as we make recommendations for the places that we're working on. So I know this is a very short sharing. I hope I've covered some aspects of this. So I kind of touched the idea of placemaking, what kind of place, how do we do the making, and I hope I've given a glimpse about how we think about data, right, and how do we collect it. So it's a very human-centric way, it's a very personal way, a very contextual way, and we tend to layer what is quantitative and qualitative so that we get a much richer data set that we can then use to design strategies and interventions and activations for our partners and clients. Yeah. So that's all I have for today. I'm just going to check the Q&A now if there's any questions. So if you have any thoughts or questions, I think we still have 5 minutes before 4 o'clock. I think that's the time given to me. So yeah, so if there's any questions, I would love to take some answers on them if you have any.
Thank you, Adib. Yeah, so if you have any questions, can put them inside the Q&A box, and then we will try to answer them.
I think I see a raised hand over there. So I think you can type it inside the Q&A chat so that I can see them directly. Yeah, I see a raised hand for Meetup. Yeah, but I don't see your question. So maybe you might want to type your question inside the Q&A.
Okay, I think there is no other questions as for now. Thank you so much, Adib, for sharing
Problem.
the webinar. So thank you all for tuning in to the webinar.
Oh, there is a question that just popped up.
Oh, let me see.
Yeah. So it asked the question, how has COVID affected the process? Yeah, so I'm just going to try and answer that. That's okay. We've got a
Sure.
couple of minutes. Yeah, so it has impacted the how we do it, right? We definitely cannot do, we are very limited in terms of face-to-face group interactions. But I think that is why we are looking at how do we humanize interactions through the digital means, through interactive webinars. So we are actually hosting a conversation happening in Aki Fest, I think it's 3rd October. So that is, so instead of focusing on the means to it, right? We try to go back about why are we doing this? And so digital means have to, we have to figure out how to replace it, but then we can always design the interaction in a different manner. So that's something that we have been thinking about a lot over the past few months. Another thing that we have been working on is, I think I shared very briefly earlier about this idea called knock knock. So we are looking at the idea of scale, right? How do we then empower neighbors to engage one another on a very small scale? So if you're not able to do a mass group engagement, how can we then change the scale but achieve the same impact but through utilizing the idea of neighborliness? So that's something that has forced us to rethink the entire process. It is not an easy question to solve, but I think that is the challenge that we all face today, right? How do we humanize video interactions and video calls that most of us have to live through day and night? Yeah. So I hope that gives a glimpse to how we're doing this. The second question by Madhu, what are some footfall data sources that you rely on to plan future projects on designing urban spaces? So for footfall data sources, we work closely with our clients or partners. Most of the time, our clients would have access to their own data sources. So for example, through sensors on their entry points, through telco data. We also supplement that with observers. So we do deploy field researchers to do sampling as well. And I think that is, again, our way of merging what is digitally collected data with our on-site, on-ground collection, and we try to reconcile those. So that's our data sources. Of course, some of it you have to do projections, right? Because it's not possible for you to do measurements at every single urban space. So that is where we have to do projections. We have to, we sometimes work with partners whose forte is about modeling footfall potential. And then our job is then to layer on this data and then see how then do we interpret this data such that it makes sense when we create new places in the future. Yeah, so I hope that gives a glimpse to how we deal with footfall data sources. Is there a collaborative process involved? Do you work with other agencies and private sector too? Yes, we work with a lot of government agencies. URA, just for Summerset, for example, right? That master plan involved us speaking to MCCY, STB, URA, NParks, PUB, IDA. So you name it, we have to work with every single government agency that handles different aspects of the land. That's the reality of working in Singapore, right? So we have to do that. Private sector, yes, again, for the Summerset Belt project, right? When we are dealing for master plan, there are various parcels that belong to different people. And everyone have their own aspirations. They have their own objectives. So our job as placemakers, as facilitators, is to carve out and understand what are all these perspectives and then figure out how then do we create a master plan or a placemaking strategy that will benefit as many people as possible for both community good, for commercial good, and also for social good, right? So how do we then, so that's our job basically. So the short answer is yes, we have to work with various agencies and private sector and communities. And that's where our job is to design the process to enable that to happen. Yeah. Okay, there's another one. So what are some of the outcomes of your research? Do they feed back into long-term master plans or concrete projects? Yeah, so for master plans, what we do is that we often submit to our clients a list of actionable strategies that they can employ in the short term, medium term, and long term, right? Um, the short term is, of course, when we look at less than a year, and this is where our light, quick, cheap methodology comes into place. We do want to get some momentum going instead of waiting for 10 to 15 years for things to unfold. And we like to see the short term or the medium term as a way to gain more data to make long-term decisions. So the master plan kind of looks at the entire spectrum of short-term, medium-term, and long-term. But of course, in Singapore or in most projects, long-term means 10 to 15 years. We haven't been around that long, been around long, but not that long. So some of these do take time to unfold. And oftentimes there are a lot of forces acting upon that is out of our control, right? So that's kind of like the nature of most master plans. As for projects, similarly, right? So there are projects that we assist our clients to execute, such as programs or transformational spaces. So we do assist our clients in doing that. But we also know that some clients, they do have in-house capabilities. So for example, some clients say they do have an in-house events team, or they do have an in-house architecture and product development team. So our job then is to guide them and coach them through the process while they do their own work. Because for us, we don't intend to stay in a project for 10, 15 years. As I mentioned just now, placemaking is a process that is collaborative, right? Everybody must get involved. If the project relies on a consultant to help them, then it probably means that project has failed. But if the stakeholders themselves can take whatever I've given them and run with it, then that is a lot more sustainable. So that's kind of like how we approach our projects or solutions that we submit to our clients. Of course, there are a couple of them that we are called back to see through. We have the capability, but often we prefer to get the stakeholders themselves to take charge of whatever that they want to unfold later on. All right. I think there's no more questions.
I think there is no more questions as for now. So yeah, thank you all for tuning in to the webinar. So before you leave, please check out our other webinars by scanning the QR code.